it's interesting because I mean, a lot of people say that using miniatures, it's just kind of turning a role-playing game into a board game. I can totally see that. You know, ultimately, to play a role-playing game, all you really should need is some dice and some paper. You know, we have a tendency to complicate these things and kind of, you know, want to buy more stuff and want to bring more stuff into it. I remember when, I don't know, 1984 or 1985, whenever it was, when I got that first D&D red box, the basic set, open it up, I was kind of disappointed. There's 2 books and some dice. And I was like, well, don't I get like a cool castle? Don't I get little guys? Don't I get some orcs running around? You know, it's quite, you know, I didn't quite understand what a role-playing game was, because back in those days you could read about it, but until you saw it or until you tried it, you just didn't ever really know. I mean, obviously, part of the gaming culture then was, you know, really tied up with miniatures, mostly due to Citadel miniatures. So I ended up getting some. Actually, my first ones weren't Citadel; they were from Prince August, where you didn't even buy the miniatures; you bought ingots and molds, and you'd cast your own figures. And they sold it as, well, this is a really cheap way to kind of create these big armies. You know, the miniatures weren't great; they were pretty basic. But you know, I got a fair few, you know, orcs and goblins and trolls that way. Moving on from there, there was a company called Rider Design or Reader Design, who was something to do with Alchemy Metalware, who used to kind of make pendants and belt buckles in the shape of like popular album covers. You know, the Motorhead Snaggletooth figure, which my dad had, which I could never quite understood because he wasn't a Motorhead fan, but I guess he just liked it. They did one that was Love Hunter, the Whitesnake album, very 70s, very hard rock, very sexist. I think you could get a belt buckle of that, and you know, you had kind of dragons and that kind of thing. But they also, I mean, actually, even thinking about it now, I'm not even sure it was the same company, but for some reason they shared ad space or something. But yeah, they were called Rider Design, and they had a bunch of really cool, you know, starter miniatures. One thing they did have was they produced a lot of female figures, and that's something that I don't think Citadel really did. Or I ended up with, you know, a very, very small percentage of female figures, but they did sell a set of dungeon adventurers, then female dungeon adventurers, and demi-humans, you know, your halflings, dwarves and elves, and then they had the female equivalent set. So you know, they were very inclusive. Yeah, it's still actually quite hard to find female miniatures sometimes. And from there, I just went straight into Citadel miniatures, and that's the kind of vast majority of minis that I've got. I think around about that time they did a Lord of the Rings license line, so I've got a lot of those. I think by that time I was playing Middle Earth role playing. I guess I thought they'd be really useful. Ended up with a lot of hobbits and a lot of dwarves and a lot of figures on horseback, and that is the one thing I never ever use in role playing games. Mounted versions of figures. You know, got like, you'd get Boromir, and then you, in the same blister, you would get Boromir on horseback. And I had an Aragorn, I had Frodo on Bill the Pony, and Gimli on a pony. Did Gimli ever even ride a pony? I know in that Ralph Bakshi movie he's riding on the back of Legolas's horse. I've got Legolas, I've got Elrond. I mean, who needs an Elrond on a horse? I don't know, but I mean, they really got into this. You buy one stud miniature and a mounted miniature. So I had a load of those. I had a load of the basic. They actually did a Dungeons and Dragons line, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons line, which was pretty cool. Again, they had a weird way of you'd buy a blister pack with three minis, and it would be fighter, and you'd get fighter at low level, fighter at mid level, and fighter at high level. And I can't really tell the difference between most of the mid level and high level ones, but you know, I have a few of those, and I guess because they were doing the Stormbringer role-playing game, they did a set of Michael Moorcock's Eternal Champion figures, and this must have been sort of near the end of my kind of engagement with the hobby, really, in the 80s, because those ones I've got are the best painted miniatures I've got, so I must have learned to paint things a bit better. I mean, I still paint everything kind of grey and black mostly, but with the Michael Moorcock writing these kind of slightly sort of psychedelic fantasies, I introduced a bit of colour with those. Yeah, a running thing with my miniatures from the 80s is grey. There's a lot of grey going on. I had some Grenadier, Lord of the Rings miniatures, and maybe a few others, and it was a big part of the hobby, because at the time, if you weren't playing role-playing games, it's obviously, like now, it's very rare to play, to find the time and to get everyone together. So when you weren't playing the game, which is most of the time, you'd either be reading about it or you'd be painting these little guys. It was kind of its own sort of strand of the hobby. Yeah, they call it lonely fun, you know, which sounds, it can sound rude, it can sound heartbreakingly tragic, so you take your pick. But yeah, when I wasn't reading, you know, White Dwarf magazine or Imagine magazine, I was painting these miniatures, and you know, probably spent way more time painting minis than ever actually using them in games. And I have miniatures that I never used in games back in the 80s, and particularly some of those Lord of the Rings, you know, mounted figures. You know, I think Citadel's intention was to kind of suck everyone into Warhammer and, you know, these big war games where you need a lot of miniatures. I mean, role playing, ultimately you don't need that many. You need your adventurers and you need a handful of monsters, really. That's all you really need. But obviously Citadel wanted to sell as many of these things as possible, and they wanted everyone playing Warhammer. And I think eventually that is sort of what happened to the hobby, particularly when they brought in Warhammer 40,000, which, you know, there was never anything remotely appealing about that world to me. But also I was getting out of the hobby then. It was becoming harder and harder to get people to play, and, you know, went to university and that kind of thing. So yeah, so there you go, there's some stuff about miniatures for you, from an old semi-grognard perspective. You really don't need to use them. Use your imagination. But if you have them and you can get hold of them, or if you can afford those you know, Premiere WizKids you know, themed miniatures, you go for it. It's about the game, so whatever you need to make your game as good as you possibly can, you go for that. So this has been a rambling video. I don't know how much use that actually is. It basically boils down to print your own minis, which, as I say, is a very unsexy thing to say. So there you go. I think this may be my last video because I can't think of any more advice, and even the advice I've given in these videos I've made is pretty thin. It's just something for me to do, work on my After Effects, and you know, not go crazy. So see you later.